So I just finished Wolfenstein 2, the new Colossus, after basically playing it nonstop through the night. From around 9 o'clock last night to 7 in the morning today, I basically did nothing but play it. I played it and I went to the restroom and ate a lot because I'm fat. I only had it for one night, so I wanted to make sure that I had, played through the entire thing. I wanted to specify I don't believe I rushed through the game. I felt like, despite doing it all in a single night, I really did feel like I had gone at the intended pace of the title. I didn't find a whole lot of collectibles. I maybe didn't explore to a huge degree, but I never felt compelled to. It's not like Doom 2016 where you have this really good incentive to explore and find things because you can unlock new abilities. Uh, the collectibles are all just concept art and stuff like that. There's really nothing major for exploring as far as I could tell. And I've just never felt compelled to find collectibles in games unless it's, like a Mario or a Jack and Daxter where finding those collectibles is kind of the entire point. I digress though. The main reason I really wanted to play through the game now instead of later, and part of the reason why I was so willing to rush through it instead of waiting until I had money to play it, was to see if the ad campaign was indicative of what people believe the game to be, which is a game that has sort of been co-opted into being this scathing takedown of the times. The era that we live in, where fascism and Nazism has sort of resurged in America, and where in a second Red Scare, almost everyone seems to be dubbed a Nazi, regardless of their actual affiliations, their actual beliefs. And in many people's eyes, it felt like Wolfenstein 2 was intentionally doing that, where we were labeling people as Nazis not by their beliefs, but rather by their race, by their unintentional beliefs. The idea that they were subconsciously feeling this and thus worthy of ridicule. I was very curious to see if that was the case in Wolfenstein 2. On top of just wanting to play the game, because Wolfenstein: The New Order is pretty amazing. I definitely think it's one of the best games of the generation. It probably would have been a top 5 game had you asked me last year, but with all the great games that have come out this year, it's probably bumped down to top 10. But regardless, fantastic game, definitely worth your time. So the short answer to that question is no. Wolfenstein 2 is not some weird leftist propaganda. It's not some weird, attempt to undermine the political opinions of the right by reinforcing this Nazi scare, or this I don't know what to call it, swastika scare maybe. There's no equivalent to the Red Scare for Nazis that doesn't immediately sound like understandable. It's not that at all. So if that's what you were worried about, it's not that. Play the game. It's great. I highly recommend it. It's really fucking hard, but it's definitely a game worth playing. It's probably the hardest game I've actually played this year. Definitely harder than any other title, and that includes Neo, a game I put quite a bit of time into, probably 60, 70 hours. Um, the long answer to that question is a lot more complex, and it's a lot more interesting than I think I expected it to be. Because, like I said, while it's not intentionally doing this, it is unintentionally doing it. It is, in many ways, indicative of the times, not because it features Nazis, but because it features a cast of characters who are built out of the civil rights movement of the 60s and the Black Panther movement and the resurgence of the Communist Party. And it creates something pretty unique and pretty entertaining, I guess is the word. So from this point forward, I'm going to go through each specific instance that people sort of bring up in order to expand why they think the game is what they think it is. I wish there was a better term for it. I'm sorry, but there's not a term that I feel comfortable saying, because it's either leftist propaganda or SJW nonsense or stuff like that. And anytime I say any of those words, I feel like a fucking retard, and you should too. So I'm just not going to do that. But I digress. The I'm going to go through them point by point and discuss them and sort of give the fuller context behind them, because that's the most important thing here is context. Uh, Never ever trust something just because you saw like a screenshot. Always try to understand the full context of it. Hold on a second here. So the first thing, so to begin with, I think it's important to understand the full context of the time we live in. Why are people so upset at the allegation of Nazism? What is the resurgence of Nazism in modern America? So I'm going to offer my personal perspective on this as I saw it kind of unfold. I was very much into politics from 2015 to 2017. This year, though I still follow a fair amount of political talk, I'm nowhere near as enticed by it as I once was. I, frankly speaking, am very burned out by it, and I really don't care all that much for it. But it is the times we live in, and I want to try and stay connected to it. I want to specify I have no direct political allegiance. I try as much as I can to avoid any political allegiance, because I think once you join up with a party or an ideology, it dumbs you down. It's an excuse to not have to entertain the opinions on the opposite side of the aisle. And I don't like that. I don't think that's how the system should be used. I don't think it's ever meant to be used that way. I think the left and the right are two halves of a whole that need each other to stay in balance. And it's become a war. It's become a cultural war of who's right and who's wrong. And I refuse to take part of it. I don't support Trump. I didn't support Hillary. I didn't vote in the election. I opted out. I didn't find either candidate completely convincing, so I sort of left my vote up to the rest of America and put my faith in their hands. With all that being said, and with no direct allegiance, I guess I'll sort of give my insight. So from 2014 onward, really from the start of Gamergate of all things, you wouldn't expect Gamergate to be where the sort of political narrative of our times began, but you'd be wrong. There was sort of a growing distrust in quote-unquote media. Gamergate especially was because it was believed that a lot of, games journalists were levying their position in order to sort of get their friends further in the industry. An industry that, by all means, seems to be pretty difficult to get into. There was the landmark case with Zoe Quinn, who was cheating on her boyfriend with someone at Polygon, I want to say. Polygon or Kotaku. It's been a while. And he had covered her game and maybe had been pushing her game. Some people have said that he reviewed her game, but that's not true. Although that was never really the core allegation, I don't believe. Anyway, this sort of had begun to seed this... This began to sow the seeds of deceit with the media. This sort of conglomerate sort of style that it was, a lot of people working with each other to sort of further their own means. Pretty soon, the narrative began to be that there was a lot of political allegiance within the people who work in games journalism. A lot of them were very leftist. A lot of them lived in San Francisco, which is an incredibly left city. And then that sort of narrative of, it became sort of a leftist quality of the media that began to spread outwards into other media, to all media, all news outlets. This is true in many ways, I want to specify. The biggest news outlets really are all the left ones. It didn't always used to be that way. There was a very long time where the right wing outlets were the most popular, and then it sort of shifted, I think, into the Obama years, and it's probably going to shift again in the Trump years, but maybe not because I don't think anyone likes Trump. Period. Now, not even on the right. So maybe it'll stay as is. Anyway, so this was a general tonal shift. That the media could not be trusted because they were on the left, and that the left was wrong. That in like having been in such a position of power for so long, the left had begun to lose sight of what made the left appealing in the first place. They had become radicalized in many aspects, and they were kind of condemning people for things they didn't have any control over, like being white, on the basis that if you're white, you automatically get certain advantages in life. Advantages that in some way are true, but are not. It's kind of like the Bechdel test, if you know that. It's not meant to be a universal law. It's really just sort of a little thought experiment. Like, well, if you're white, this is one problem you just don't deal with, because white racism is not a prominent thing in America. And it's supposed to make you go like, I guess that's true. That's one thing I didn't have to deal with. Maybe we should take some greater steps to fixing that. But in reality, when people use it, they use it to sort of put you into a corner. They sort of use it to tell you like, well, you have privilege, so you need to sit down. It's not your time, as now, and it infuriates people in many ways, rightfully so, I would say. So this led to a general distrust of the media, with the perception that this distrust was justified because they were on the left. So in 2015, 2016, somewhere around here, the alt-right began to form. And in its early stages, I remember thinking very vividly what the alt-right was, without actually knowing anything. I remember thinking to myself, the alt-right are people who hold right-wing positions but do not hold the social implications on the right. The right wing had become very prominently known for a very long time as very religious. They were very much, gun nuts. They, wanted to crank down on immigration. Just a very obscene group, a group that was really difficult to please, and a group that in many ways seemed inhumane. And it seemed to me the alt-right were a group of people who had more liberal social beliefs, but did share a lot of ideology with the right. They wanted, to reclaim the right wing as a group of people who are primarily in it to reduce government. Understandable. Pretty clearly, the most prominent voices in the alt-right were a lot more extreme than that. They were talking up they were becoming the antithesis to what they believed the left was. Where instead of, you should be ashamed because you're white, it became you should be proud because you're white. And this began to open up to allegations of Nazism from people who frankly didn't quite share a whole lot of Nazi beliefs. But by this point, the term Nazi had been thrown around a lot. It was a very easy way to deplatform someone by calling them a Nazi, but there was a general distrust in the media as well. So you had a bunch of people being called Nazis for sort of white supremacy beliefs. Maybe not supremacy, but white pride. For the record, racial pride, period, is retarded. It's not something to be proud of. Regardless. I know there's a lot of people who are pretty firmly against, or pretty firmly for the concept of sort of protecting their culture, and that they should be proud of all the struggle their people has gone through. And I understand that, but it's ridiculous. You didn't go through it. If you didn't directly go through it, it's not something to be proud of. That's my hardline stance on that. Culture and race, though often developing at the same time, are not the same thing. I'm going a little off topic here, though. So you had a general tone that these people were Nazis from from media groups that a lot of people just no longer trusted, and the allegation of Nazism began to take on a different stance. It began to deteriorate, and in many ways, it became a badge of honor. That if you're going against the machine of the left, you must be doing something right. I didn't mean for that to be a pun. I'm sorry. Point being, going forward to Wolfenstein 2's announcement, and there's a lot of imagery that seems very potent in the current political climate. You know, Nazis have taken over America, literally. There was a sequence, you know, in the debut trailer where the Nazis and the Klan were hanging out together. Though historically, the Ku Klux Klan were not super fond of the Nazis. Events in the timeline of Wolfenstein are so different that it's understandable that may not be the case here. And with all this, it was pretty easy to sort of... I think with that context, it's easy to see why people are upset. Because they, in many ways, people who didn't fully understand Wolfenstein, who maybe didn't play the last game and didn't understand the level of nuance it had, I think they came into it and they sort of saw it and they immediately thought, this is a response to what's happening in America today, and took it in a very wrong way. That is not the case. The developers, Machine Games, have been very upfront. This is not a response to current politics. The game had been written in 2014, but Bethesda didn't seem to have a whole lot of faith in it. So instead of it coming out in 2014, they sort of waited. They made Wolfenstein the Old Blood, which did pretty well, and from there they began to fund development of the new Colossus, and it was pretty good, all in. Probably a smart decision on their part. I originally thought there had been a longer development cycle between the New Order and the new Colossus, but there really hasn't been. I thought the New Order came out in 2014. It came out in 2015, which I was pretty surprised by. So all in all, it's, you know, it's an understandable sort of path that the series has taken. I really don't think... What the fuck am I talking about? I'm retarded. So these initial concerns had seemed pretty absurd to me at the time, and I really resented it, because I was so excited to play Wolfenstein again. I was really happy to see where that world was going and to get another chance to play it. And I felt like it was being tainted. I felt like it was being encroached upon by people who clearly didn't play video games. That was one of the big rallying cries, I remember, during the Gamergate thing, during a lot of this debacle. It's like, these people don't play video games. They're not your core audience. And here you had people who somehow didn't understand what Wolfenstein was about and didn't understand the elongated development that a game goes through. It just seemed absurd. And I don't necessarily think those are the same people. I don't think the people who were talking smack about them for not understanding video games were also upset at Wolfenstein necessarily, but I think there was some crossover. There's definitely someone who was in both camps. I might know him personally. So these initial concerns seemed pretty absurd, but in the ramp up to the game's release, a lot of the advertising was done on Twitter, where they sort of co-opted some political slogans. The most prominent one was, you know, hashtag Make America Nazi Free Again. Take on Donald Trump's Make America Great Again. Arguably, those statements are the same thing. It's, I think, much clearer that the marketing for the game really did want to comment on the times. They definitely wanted to tie into it. But the marketing department of a studio is rarely directly connected to the development department. And even if they are, I think you'd be foolish not to take advantage of it in some way. I think if you were I think if Wolfenstein was about fighting communists, and like, you didn't like tweet out like hashtag block parties over Negroes. I think you'd be remiss. I think it'd be a missed opportunity, and I think it definitely helped. There's a lot of people talking about Wolfenstein who probably wouldn't have been talking about it before. So I don't really see anything wrong with that necessarily. Maybe it's tasteless, maybe it's stupid, but personally speaking, looking at it, I don't really hold it against them. So to talk about the specific instances here, most of this is from memory, so excuse me if there's one that maybe hasn't made sense. The first one is the character of Grace. She is a black woman. She's got a big afro. I remember when the E3 came out, there was like an image. It was like a collage of like, we want diversity in video games, and then they showed like 4 black women who were in games at E3 that all had like the exact same character design. I thought that was pretty funny. But I think she's the only one whose design is justified because she's an actual character. I think that's another thing, is I think a lot of people didn't know Wolfenstein takes place in the 1960s. I think they thought it was a World War II thing, and it's not. Or at least not the New Order timeline. The New Order games take place in the 1960s and 1970s. So she leads a group, a resistance group against the Nazis out of Manhattan, which is now a desolate wasteland. It's been nuked to hell and back. Her character is mostly heroic. She takes on sort of a leadership role after the previous leader of the group dies. Like I said, spoilers here, my dudes. And her character is mostly heroic, mostly presented as in the right, but there's a pretty strong arc with her and another character where she's definitively in the wrong. There's another character who's a Nazi defector, there's a character who's a Nazi defector who she is very dismissive of and takes advantage of. She very much is like, you have to do this and this because you're the Nazi, so like the command codes. So you're the only one who knows how to do this. And then she goes like, yeah, and fuck off. And that arc definitely resolves with her in the wrong. Grace is definitely presented as in the wrong for those events, and in the resolution to it, she has to sort of come to terms with it. In her opening bid, she does talk a lot about race. She does talk a fair amount about the negativity of masculinity. In a sequence, though, that makes sense in the context of her character, and does not necessarily feel like preaching. As you're watching the sequence, she's like, I heard, Caroline, previous leader of the group, I heard that she was real tough, and BJ goes like, yeah, she had balls of steel, and she goes like, why are balls always what people talk about when they talk about being a badass, and kind of goes into detail on that, and BJ just sort of laughs it off, and he's like, yeah, that's like, yeah, that's a mystery, in a way that's kind of like, not like, yeah, you're right, it's fucking retarded, but in sort of a like, is that really what we're gonna discuss now in the middle of wasteland of Manhattan? Maybe we should get out of here. It's also worth noting that the game does not really spend a whole lot of time talking about race. In fact, I think it spends less time talking about race than the last game did. If you played the New Order and you save Wyatt, you have a character, a young black man, who at one point in the game has a very heated argument with BJ over race in America. That young character is Jimi Hendrix, for the record, and then you drop acid and play guitar with him, and it's pretty cool. It's pretty fucking rad. For the record, I did do Wyatt in this game as well, so if there's any major differences between the versions, I unfortunately can't speak for them, but I kind of doubt it. I really doubt there's that much of a difference. I doubt the other version is more desperate or more violent or more racial. Grace herself is an interracial couple. She's in an interracial relationship with a man named Special Spesh, who believes that the Nazis are being controlled by aliens, which is pretty funny because I remember a lot of people kind of thought that the New Order might go that route. I remember watching Giant Bomb's quick look for Wolfenstein: The New Order, and going like, "Holy shit, are there going to be aliens in this game?" And it's not; it's Jews, which is way funnier. So having him sort of show up, I think is having him sort of show up and act as that mouthpiece was, I think, one of the funner tongue-in-cheek things they do in the game. Other than that, you know, that one's the big one. That's the big character people are sort of worried about. That's sort of the big moment. Also in that sequence, BJ says, like, "You white-ass Nazi fascist pigs." He's doing it kind of as a joke, because he's trying to appeal to Grace and her group to allow him to sort of join up with his resistance group. So he's sort of like mirroring them, and it's definitely played for comedy. It's not played as like yeah, fuck Whitey. It's very much played for comedy and playing off of BJ's sort of awkwardness. And it makes perfect sense, especially like a character in the civil rights era, even in Nazi-occupied America. Just the wording and the terminology works. And that's kind of what I wanted to highlight with the concept of the Ouroboros of progress, is what was once thought as, you know, cutting edge is now considered recursive. We believe, you know, like once upon a time, this sort of intense anti-white rhetoric, maybe not even anti-white rhetoric necessarily, but just sort of highlighting the racial tension through the Black Panther movement, was very much on the cutting edge of progress and very much exactly kind of what America needed to sort of confront race. Nowadays, that exact same rhetoric is still being used to shove race into the forefront, but in many ways it's used to drive a wedge further between the races. I definitely feel like a few years ago I didn't think about race nearly as much as I do now, but I also feel like now I'm, in some weird ways, more uncomfortable talking to people from different races. Growing up, I mostly had black friends. I mostly grew up in a black neighborhood. I didn't really think about it. And then, you know, all of a sudden I was being bombarded with this sort of message of, like, you know, the complications of race, and it felt like I was living my life wrong in a weird way. That still doesn't really keep me from being friends with black people. Obviously, my best friend in the world is a black gay immigrant who don't need no man and will be heard. But even with all that, you know, there's this weird, like, undercurrent to our times of race that I think is actively pulling us backwards in a lot of ways. The other major character is, I forget his name. It's not Professor. Damn, how did I forget this character's name? He's a communist. He's part of another resistance group in New Orleans. You meet up with him, and he's very much a communist. And there's a sequence, there's like a party sequence, and he has a party hat with a hammer and sickle on it. And people were like, "Oh boy, teaming up with the commies to fight the Nazis," which we actually did. That's a real thing that happened. No one fought the Nazis harder than the communists. Maybe no one did as good a job as fighting the Nazis as the communists, all things considered. So there's a couple of important reasons for why communism might work in the context of Wolfenstein, whereas it doesn't in America. The main reason communism doesn't work in our modern time is simply because we've seen it in action in Russia, we've seen it in action in China, we've seen it in action in Spain, I want to say. Was Mussolini a communist? I can't remember. Maybe not Spain. We've seen it in action. We see it in action in Venezuela today. Vietnam. We've seen it in action all over the world, and it never works. It always leads to a drastic drop in quality of life, and it always leads to dictatorships. That's simply the way it is. In the world of Wolfenstein, that has not happened, obviously. The only real regime, the only dictatorship that the world has really known is the Wolfenstein one. The horrors of the Russian war machine likely never came to light, because in many ways, not many of them happened. There's no Cold War. There's no Red Scare. It's all Nazism. It's all fascism. So the strongest counter-arguments to communism, which is communism in practice doesn't work, because we've seen it not work, doesn't really hold firm in the Wolfenstein universe. The other thing is the communist character is very much depicted as being in the wrong. When he and BJ first meet, they have a lengthy discussion on the nature of anarchy and on the war machine. And he criticizes BJ, you know, like, you didn't, because he did not, there's a pretty complex scene that's very fast-paced. It's very difficult to break it down for me, purely from memory. But in short, the communist character is not presented as being super heroic. He is sort of presented as a coward whose unwillingness to participate in the war only led to the rise of fascism. That his pacifism did not save him, nor did it save the world. It only meant that fascism had less to fight against. An all-around pretty solid sequence. One of probably the best sequences in the game, I would say. Those are the two major ones. And really, beyond those moments, it's not really a presence. The game is far more interested in the personal struggle of BJ Blazkowicz in the early game, and then the sort of rise of the resistance in the latter game. Like I said previously, I do recommend the game. I found it really fun, really enticing. And I think it's very interesting that by being an accurate representation of where politics were in the 60s in America, it has become timely again. Again, that's what I mean by the Ouroboros of progress, is that we have come back to eat our own tail. I've seen this happen before. I'm a very big fan of H.P. Lovecraft. I think he's a fascinating person. And a pretty interesting aspect of him is how he viewed race. You probably have heard that Lovecraft was a pretty huge racist, and a lot of his work is based on the idea that his own blood lineage is maybe not as clean as he wanted it to be. And while that's true, I think it's important to realize when H.P. Lovecraft lived, and also what an awkward person he was. There's a lot of strong evidence to point to that Lovecraft did not believe these racist beliefs as hard as maybe he would have liked you to think. That's a shitty sentence. For one thing, he married a Jew, which if you were a racist was not cool at the time. That was a bad thing to be doing. For another thing, he was actually pretty heavily against the Nazis. Again, in an era where there were a lot of Americans who were for the Nazis. There was a lot of Americans who were definitely pro-Nazism. Big corporations who believed in the rise of the Nazi war machine and who believed it maybe should come to America. Definitely check that out. I want to say Ford? Maybe not Ford. There was like a big oil baron who definitely was like, even though the United States said no one can send support to the Nazis, he definitely like shipped them a shit ton of oil because he wanted them to win. And if they won, you know, America wasn't going to do shit. I think that oil company's still around. But basically, H.P. Lovecraft believed that races should be kept separate, but also that people should hold a pretty strong personal cultural identity. He believed that they should not integrate, but rather they should celebrate their own individual culture. And for a very long time, that was considered a very racist point of view. that integration of races was inevitable and that it should be celebrated. But now we're sort of back to it, like with cultural appropriation and the narrative of, you need to understand, like I said previously, the narrative of us sort of pushing race even further to the forefront than we have in the last decade or so. So seeing it in action in Wolfenstein 2 is maybe not necessarily surprising so much as it is unexpected. That seeing it in practice in such a wide scale way, and just sort of the coincidence of it. I've seen some people complain that the ending is a super Antifa sort of deal. It's not. It's just a general revolutionary thing. It's sort of like when people said that Donald Trump quoted Bane from The Dark Knight Rises in his acceptance speech. He didn't. It was just a general, it's just a thing people say. It's an empty platitude of like, I'm going to take it from the Bolsheviks, I'm going to take it from the bourgeois, and I'm going to give it to the people. Like, almost every president has said that maybe that exact sentence, but the same sentiment in their speech. Giving America back to the people is one of the most cliche things a politician can say. That's really it. I have some general thoughts on Wolfenstein 2 that I might produce later on if anyone's interested, but it's definitely a recommendation for me, but I do think you should play the original first. It's not a game that you can just sort of jump into. You really need to have played the original and understand the characters to get the full effect that the game is going for. And I think in a lot of ways, if you only play this one, it's not going to work. I think it's going to become a kind of confusing mess for you. But that's me. That's my thoughts on the Wolfenstein 2 debacle. I hope it was enlightening. I hope it put some fears to ease. Maybe gave some fuller context, and hopefully you'll stick around to see what else I make. It's shit. That's the only thing I make. It's shit directly from my ass.